Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Culture and Creativity Policy Network dialogue session. I'm Dan Ashton, one of the coordinators of the network, along with Joseph Owen and Alex Reynolds, who is today going to chair the session and introduce Simon. So, Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, great to be here. I'm going to move past really quickly actually over to Simon to begin his talk, and then we'll have some time after that to go through some questions that that we may have as a panel, Dan, Joe and I, before opening out onto the floor. So yes, without further ado, I'll pass over to Simon. Thank you.
I will find all the right buttons to press. Hello, thank you so much for having me. And I really like the swift handover. I always find like when you do things like this, sometimes you be like, I'll read the bio that's on your website. It's probably out of date, and you just sit there feeling very awkward. So this is a much more convivial way of doing it. So that's amazing. Thank you. So yeah, my name's Simon Moreton. I'm Associate Professor of Creative Economies at UWE Bristol. And I'll just be saying this while my slides are sharing. And yeah, today's talk sort of comes from and thank you, Dan, for inviting me to come along and have a chat about this. This is a paper that I wrote a few years ago, but I think still is more and more relevant now. So this is a really nice opportunity for me to kind of revisit that with a kind of more recent paper I co-wrote with some colleagues, and just try and kind of like shake the ideas out a little bit, and be really great to kind of have some chat with you all about that as well. I'm going to press this button and hope that you can see my screen. Please do let me know when it's shared. Can you see something that looks like a PowerPoint? Knowledge exchange in the advanced humanities. Amazing.
All good, thank you.
Great. So the talk draws on two papers, as I mentioned. So one was for Research for All. That was about 2021, which is the kind of where the title comes from, Knowledge Exchange in the Arts and Humanities as Creative Economy Policy Assemblage. I didn't put a colon in that title, so that must be some kind of a win for academic work. And then it also partially draws on and a little bit of, I kind of thought a little bit about this stuff in a recent paper that I wrote with Liz Roberts and Jack Lowe, both at UWE as well, for a special issue looking at the work of the AHRC Creative Industries Clusters Programme. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So I draw on these papers in order to consider like how a version of creativity based on economic logics and neoliberal imagination has become kind of manifest in a series of university-run programs designed to support growth in the creative sector. I'll say a little bit more about some examples of those in a second. But essentially, I've been interested since my PhD, which I started a grand total of 20 years ago. I should say I have finished it as well. I didn't just start it 20 years ago. I finished it. I've been interested in what work the word creativity does in society, basically. I've always been very suspicious of its current and continuing assembly and how it operates and what it gets done. And that's partly an academic interest and partly as an artist and a writer and an artist, I suppose. I also have this other kind of contested sort of lived version of creativity and art and stuff that is kind of in tension sometimes with the intellectual version that I think about. So I'm kind of interested in those things. And I'm interested really in like how totalizing this idea of the creative industries, creative economy, this vision of creativity really is. And that's kind of led me to think in recent years about how it's become performed in a very specific context. We probably all know from the work that we do and the work that you do, the kind of from teaching to everywhere, how creativity is kind of embedded in sort of everything. It's like a lingua franca for stuff, which has a sort of rudimentary kind of analysis behind it. Nobody doesn't want to be creative. I think that was Jamie Peck said that 20 years ago, something like that. You know, it's sort of a fairly standard thing that's everywhere, that's ubiquitous. And it's quite hard to disentangle where that all came from. But in this context, I'm looking at drawing on sort of what is now 13, 14 years working on different programs that involve receiving money from the state via the Arts Humanities Research Council, usually, but not exclusively, sometimes UKRI, to basically starting a stopwatch. You set to start to create impact on the creative economy, essentially. What that really looks like is we get money as a consortium of universities, and that we become a funder for particular kinds of creative activity. The way that we've done that at UWE in partnership with regional universities and Watersheds, which is an arts organisation in Bristol, is very much through the kind of lens of creative technology, through this idea that creativity, technology, art, culture, commerce can all sit together in a particular kind of milieu. And if you look after the way that happens, then good things can happen. We've always tried to do that in a particular kind of way that puts people first rather than profit. But as I'll talk about today, that becomes really entangled because the key performance indicators, the funding, the driver for these kinds of programs is very much about economic growth and development. So on this slide, there's the Creative Industries Clusters program, which ran until 2024. I was a co-investigator on the Bristol+Bath Creative R+D, which is the cluster, one of 9 clusters within that period, and I became director of it in this last year. Prior to that, I was part of the REACT, which was one of 4 arts and humanities Research Council funded knowledge exchange hubs for the creative economy, which was sort of their first foray, 2012, 2016, of funding sort of arm's length knowledge exchange knowledge exchange projects. But also you can see this kind of spilling out into loads of things now. There's Strength and Places Fund, My World, which is a really big Bristol-based one, 30 million quid from UKRI to do arguably business as usual creative computing, but essentially it's about improving the creative industries, and various other programs. CoStar, I think you may have heard of as well, which is an infrastructure project. There's essentially a lot going on. I did have a total for how much money they've spent since 2012, but I couldn't find it. But it's quite big. It's quite a lot of money, and this is all very. Being involved in these programs or running these programs, it tends to put you the headroom between you and, let's say, the director of the AHRC is quite small, because you're kind of in contact with the funding council, the kind of the people there, because these are big investments for them as well, and they're very politically driven by a particular kind of economic context. This is my advisor, Dizzy, who has cunningly passed on me to the next slide before I was going to quite get there. So in order to think about how I've been thinking about how universities have become engaged in the kind of work that we're looking at, which is becoming funders for creative R&D in the creative and cultural sector, very broadly understood, but essentially in ways that are reducible to economic growth, GVA, jobs created, that kind of thing, a very particular vision of it. I've drawn on kind of sort of 3 things in this paper. One is governmentality, which is sort of something that might be well known to everybody from Foucault, which is sort of like the broad sense of procedures for directing human conduct, and where governmentality kind of thinks about those procedures are managed more or less strategically, rationalized, and kind of developed to achieve particular kinds of ends. And I've been sort of thinking about those things in relation to governmentality for quite a while, because it's kind of provided a framework for thinking about the different, often competing and not entirely totalizing ways in which an idea gets flow. So obviously the obvious example is like the way in which creative industries as a policy emerged 20 years ago, how it became tied into all sorts of different kinds of things around Britannia and national identity and economic development and place-based wealth and post-industrial landscapes, the reanimation of cities, and then into things like Richard Florida. And there's this whole family of kind of like behaviors and policies that they kind of reflect a certain sense of, a mindset and a particular way of bringing things into being. And governmentality, although it kind of has kind of developed from a kind of very specific form of governance that Foucault was looking at in the 17th and 18th centuries, is actually kind of toward the end of its life, it was kind of thinking more of a general set of tools for decomposing power and how it was operating in particular ways. And Amanda Bill argues in 2016 that like creativity has now become part of the regulatory grammar of contemporary society, and she alludes to the process through which that regulation is performed, particularly as an object of government rationalities. So this idea that actually, you know, everybody wants to be creative, students want to be creative, we need a creative workforce, creativity will save us all these kinds of things become particular parts of those processes of governmentality. But governmentality is quite good at kind of big picture stuff, but it's not always the nitty gritty and the kind of counterflows and the kind of ways in which it all fits together, not necessarily super good for that, not designed for that. So I've kind of been drawing a bit on assemblage theory for this, thinking about assemblages as the kind of contingent and creative ensemble of ways of doing stuff, people, things, places, ideas, mundane and grand devices, kinds of authority, spatialities, which for those of us who are geographers is very important, and that converge in a particular way. So when I was thinking about the university and the creative sector, I was thinking about it as in terms of an assemblage. That is to say, we often talk about the university as a kind of a monolithic thing. You know, as individual academics, we might be like, oh yeah, I'm fine, thanks. Yeah, I'm doing really well. But the university is really slowing this down. You know, we imagine it as a totalizing thing, but actually, it's just this kind of barely held together system of different interactions and different kinds of stuff. And if you think about like, you know, a kind of university creative economy knowledge exchange kind of assemblage, you think about those links that are more or less strong between funding policies, between, you know, quite hard and fast like rules and branding and universities around creativity, around student, particularly for a university like UWE, which is one of the former, it was a post-92 university, has lots of art students and kind of creative industry stuff. There's all the stuff about like job pipelines and skills and all that kind of stuff. And there's both sort of like, you know, the grand devices of realizing these kinds of collaborations. So they're often, the assemblies often become centered around these large programs or bidding for these large programs where people come together for a brief period of time in order to create a system that operates to deliver this money, but also deliver this ideology where academics, creatives sit together and somehow things happen at that intersection where other things kind of happen as well. And so what I like about this, as complicated as it is, because sometimes you kind of go, well, wait, which bit's assembling, which bit's the assembly? And you sort of have to do a bit of an arbitrary kind of delineation of where you end up with that kind of stuff. But it's just a way of thinking through how things come together. And then I was also thinking about policy transfer as well in this paper, which was trying to work out how do things move? How do things move from, you know, one context to another? Because the creative industries policy of the 2001, which kind of, you know, categorized all of the different, you know, what was and what was not a creative industry, the later rethinking about creative economy, so that's talking about creative labor within non-creative professions as well as the other kind of stuff. None of it actually really explicitly set out to be involved in the university at all. And so the reason that universities are involved is due to a kind of a various number of factors, which we explore more in that later paper, which is to do with, you know, the rise of the knowledge economy, the kind of defunding of universities, the kind of universities becoming, you know, spaces for commercial knowledge development, the third mission for universities to kind of try and do all of those other things other than the first two missions being research and teaching. So there's loads of different reasons how this is, and for this kind of transfer. But what happens when you think about how that occurs? So you can think about policy transfer as kind of not being only transferred over like space, as in like here's a policy object, here's a way of doing creativity and creative economy in like business, so let's put it into the university. It changes on its way over there, you know, as it kind of moves. It has to be kind of like redefined by policymakers, thinkers, consultation, opportunity, chance, accident to kind of land a little bit differently. Sometimes that transfer happens at the point of introduction, sometimes it happens over time. So a very good example of this, I think, is always when we think about knowledge exchange models for creative economy, they're often based off ones that come from high-tech industry or engineering. You know, there's a bit more transactional, there's something you can sell, ways of working are very established, the people you're working with are very established. You know, here's Boeing, we're $1 billion $, whatever company. We want some students to help us understand this tiny component. You get some IP, we get some labor, whatever, that kind of stuff. And we know that doesn't work in the same way in the creative thing. So you've got this thing that kind of gets moved from one place to another, but has to kind of change to fit in. The second is that in theory, the place where the policy comes from and the place where it lands also changes. So there's like a ripple effect. So once you have to have new policies and practices to deliver this stuff, then that changes. And if you think about where that changes within the university with these big programs, is our experience of running them is you're funding different kinds of people to do stuff. Universities aren't really set up to be funders. You've got a new audience, you've got a new kind of target market, which is often freelance micro business creatives who are looking for some money to support some R&D, looking for that kind of stuff. And so there's a kind of a transformation where it lands. But you also then see things like universities bigging up their work with the creative industries because they're so great. So then you see these discourses and languages and marketing stuff following that around. Thirdly, yes, about the kind of about the hybridity that kind of gets produced, and finally, the fourth thing is about kind of like success or failure. Even if like this policy transfer isn't deliberate and hasn't landed or worked, even, which we could arguably talk about in a minute whether it works or not, it still has an effect. So it's even though we're trying in the very attempt to try and say universities are now drivers of the creative economy in this very specific way, which is to fund them and to play a state-led role in the development of the creative industries around a particular vision of the creative industries. Even if that policy transfer fails, it's still kind of affected and changed essentially and reconfigured the site in which those policy things land. So in the paper that kind of drawing on here, I talk a lot about React, which was the project around from 2012 to 2016. And we had 4 million quid from the AHRC. And what we had to do was basically, their only stipulation was you're funding the creative sector to come up with new ideas, new products, new services that have an impact on their business. But when you fund them, they have to work with an academic. And so we used a model called Sandbox, which has been developed by Watershed as a kind of a means of building cohorts of discrete projects, normally around 6 projects, but working together around a united theme. So you bring everybody together, you kind of crowdsource all the different skills and stuff. So different projects help each other. We have skills within their project team, but also across. And so you build a kind of a sort of momentum around that. Then we had 6 themes, 55 companies involved, that kind of stuff. And so I talk in the paper about the way in which the setup and delivery of that program followed a certain kind of sequence almost of events or processes that you can identify in that kind of sort of policy transfer, assemblage changing kind of space. But before I start to say about that, I just want to kind of revisit this idea of redefining the field of activity first, which is something that we talk a bit more about in the later paper, which is the idea of re-territorialization. So this idea that in order for university assemblages to kind of spread out to kind of meet these new spaces and these new audiences and new communities, they have to kind of revisit their own purpose. They have to redefine why they're doing that kind of stuff. And I've mentioned this a bit already, but just to kind of recap really, that for me, it's the third mission that is where this sits. So that complicated space, which is sort of about the civic engagement of universities. So they're having to involve themselves in local environments, businesses, etc., in more and more ways. The pressure to commercialize, capitalize on knowledge in economic means as a consequence of being defunded, but also this idea that we are all knowledge producers and knowledge is worth money. The knowledge economy is another one. I think another driver for or another kind of form of activity in that is to do with justification. So universities are publicly funded, so they've got to do stuff out in the world that demonstrates that our knowledge, our production, our processes, we have something to kind of offer. And obviously in a capitalist society, that tends to land in a way that's manageable and measurable rather by money. But I think also it's you know, and I'm saying these things in quite a cynical way, and I obviously do believe that like lots of us in the kind of assemblage do believe in like the power of creativity, the good of all these kinds of things. I should kind of emphasize that as well. The challenge is how when we talk about this in the paper as well, how we at the scale that we're at actually manage to kind of like suppose deliver against that kind of thing. How do we actually manage to kind of achieve that in that system? So universities, by presenting themselves as creative universities, having creative campuses, you know, aligning themselves with particular local partnerships and all those kinds of things. That's sort of one of the kind of the ways in which these assemblages are kind of put together to kind of almost like rationalize this idea that, oh, we've always been working with the creative sector. We've always worked with the cultural sector, which you could argue that in some respects universities have. You know, we've had a long history of relationship between like museums and traditional cultural institutions and universities and arts generally speaking, you know, and that kind of stuff. And also like pre-assembly into the creative industries, computing, like we've all fed into these kinds of things for a long time, but it's the kind of the new package almost. So one of the things that we saw with React, and to update that with things like Bristol+Bath Creative R+D and My World, is this idea that one of the ways to go about that is by rebuilding coalitions. So this idea that you find the people that are you know, they want to do the same work as you, but also are kind of that represent the sort of partnerships you want to imagine, you know, dress for the job that you want and create the partnerships that you kind of want. So with React, that was coalitions with other universities, but also trying to understand how to engage with the creative sector. And that's where working with Watershed was again a very important thing for us, because they had a huge network of kind of creative technology, cultural producers, artistic stuff, you know, throughout kind of city there. And that's a kind of really important part of this kind of stuff. It's like you establish your team and you establish this kind of stuff. And there are various processes within that when you're kind of, you know, writing a bid, various technologies of discipline, like so writing the bid, going to the kind of town hall meetings, sitting down with the different people, trading horses about like who gets what funding for what, where and when. So there's all these kind of like, these are like the mundane as opposed to the grand things that sit around your vision that kind of tend to shape those things. And it tends to be that the further away you get from that core team of often, like I say, very well-meaning and very excited individuals, you start to see some of those trade-offs into a particular kind of understanding of creativity where you have to define it in ways that is seen by people outside of the space. And so often, you know, that kind of thing happens in that kind of space. Often to get the funding, and then in order to keep the funding and in order to engage with people and take part in these systems, you're sort of performing these discourses of creative economics. You kind of, you know, our experience in React and Bristol+Bath Creative R+D and things like that was a version of creativity is important. Creativity matters. It can generate value it generates value in society. You can think about that as economic value. That's part of it, absolutely. But there's also these other ways of doing it. And that was the kind of message that we have always had and always ascribed to. But that's quite hard to maintain, because you've got to borrow the language that surrounds you to make yourself legible and engage in those processes, while at the same time trying to negotiate that language and try to kind of affect change within it. You know, and another way that we notice this is with regards to who you're speaking to. You know, so if we're talking to a series of like, you know, technology practitioners who might want funding, they probably don't really care about the reconstitution of the university as a third space for new innovation. But what they do care about is, have you got somebody who can help you do this idea? So you sort of, you know, your audience means you were talking in different ways anyway. So you then have this sort of like funny fractured discourse, but you're always drawing on the languages to do that kind of stuff. And as we know from various things, you know, discourse has material effects as well. So that's kind of a big part of that. Another thing that I start thinking about in the paper, and something I'd like to think about more in the future, is the kind of the reformulation of kind of space and time in these sort of relationships and in these sort of programs. In React, we often talked about like the idea that we were kind of like a gearing mechanism between the universities and the creative sector. We talked about it less as we kind of went on, but there's sort of like, you know, I wrote something even back in 2018, I think it was, about kind of academics being cast as sort of like deeply knowledgeable, curious creatures, but slow moving and obscure with a tendency towards abstraction. Whilst as creative businesses are pitched as lean, hungry, agile, and focused, sinking or swimming by the quality of their product. And that's like an imaginary, right? That is drawn on particular kinds of truths, but it's not really totalizing. But when you start to do that in your kind of the way that you talk about things and the way you deliver things, you start to instantiate certain things in particular ways. So if you're not being attendant to these particular kinds of stereotypes and whatever, you actually start to reproduce the power inequities in those kinds of ideas. So like, like creativity is like a really contradictory paradigm in its kind of current thing, because on the one hand, it's kind of aggressively individualizing, in terms of like my money, my product, my idea, my thing, but it's also very collectivizing. So it's sort of like, it's about, hey, creativity, we're all together, we can do this as a kind of collective act, because obviously that's where creative culture begins. And you end up kind of, very often kind of intending exploitation as a kind of form of like, or self-exploitation as a form of emancipation. Hey, I can have a creative career, I can be what I like, but actually what you're doing is working in an unequal sector for low pay and all those kinds of things as well. Anyway, so this gearing mechanism is this way of thinking about imagining how fast people work, where people work, what the relationship between there. So, the example that like creatives work fast, relentlessly and fluidly, and with energy produced or being produced by unhealthy work cultures, such as long working hours and tight deadlines. And have, you can say that about creative things, the crunch culture of that kind of stuff. But I'm not entirely sure there's an academic in the room who doesn't also feel like they have to work beyond the speed and beyond the capacities of their particular, temporality and spatialities and where they work. And often these kinds of gearing things occur in third spaces, so spaces outside the university, outside the workplace of the business, and in these kind of imagined third spaces. And while you can have both the progressive desire to be attendant to how space and time is manipulated to kind of create this sort of hybrid space, you can also end up reproducing a lot of the problematics that exist within that imaginary of how creatives work, how academic works, how knowledge and values flow. And like the final sort of major thing is the one that we all know about, which is calculative practice. How do we count success? How do we measure value? How do we do this kind of thing? And in the years I've been working on these programs, with the React in the first few years, they were like, they are to have some key performance indicators. When I worked on that project as the research fellow who was in charge of the evaluation and the data capture and all that kind of stuff. When I had my job interview, I had to do a presentation on KPIs. So I didn't know what KPI was. I looked it up, did my thing. And then after I got the job, my boss was like, we didn't have a clue what a key performance indicator was. So thanks for telling us. So it was a new language, a new kind of mode of measurement, a new technique of, government, new form of rationality of like, if you can like, reduce something to, Rose talks about is like rendering government technical by recourse to numbers as incontrovertible representations of truth, when in fact they're political outcomes used to promote web governing as objective and thus legitimate. And that is exactly what this stuff does. So these kinds of KPIs, and they've intensified massively over the years, job creation, was the one that kind of emerged during the Creative Clusters program was around co-investment, particular definitions of what co-investment means, bringing money in, i.e., if the state spends this much on supporting creative work, look how much money they make and bring in. This idea that the private sector will kind of pick up the flow inwards, that became very important as well in austerity, obviously. What other kinds of KPIs? So basically, there's just a series of measurements and ways of defining, counting, and shaping, and they're all reducible to money, basically. Or they are used money as a proxy for something, or they are themselves about money generated, and so on and so forth. And we know these things are kind of flaky. Because when I started Bristol+Bath Creative R+D, when we started that program in 2018-ish, something like that, I remember talking to the AHRC's the person at that point who was like our relationship sort of manager about, no, sorry, not the relationship manager, the monitoring evaluation person. And I was like, so what's your definition of a job? And they were like, what's your definition of a job? And that was basically what happened. And if you work in this kind of area, those kinds of metrics, you'll also know that none of these are actually fixed. They're all arbitrary kind of conjecture around particular kind of things, but they're represented and then used to wag the dog. And so that's something that's very, very important. This is just a picture of where it all started, which obviously we know about. There's everyone looking at the wonderful Millennium Dome. Here's just some stuff about the Creative Industries Cluster Programme, just as kind of illustration of some of this kind of stuff. The alignment between the government's industrial strategy and the Arts and Humanities Research Council, so that kind of like that close link between the university suddenly and the government delivery programme. The Policy and Evidence Centre, which was established in order to kind of metricise, count and understand quantitatively everything to do with the creative economy. Something around this kind of discourse, £92 billion for the UK economy and 46 billion in goods. I mean, this was a few years ago where this particular piece of text came from. And then all the kind of like, and then that thing about kind of who's you're collaborating with, who's your kind of cohort there, the UK's best performing world-renowned creative companies from this sector to that sector, you know, British patriotism, all that kind of stuff. And so you can even see just in this page, quite a lot of that work of redefining the shapes of the extent of like the assemblage and all that kind of stuff in there. And if we were at all worried that this was, you know, going to get any better, the creative sector vision from a couple of years ago says we need to make the most of universities, their ability to champion spin-outs and their ability to enrich local SMEs with their applied research. And this to me echoes something that happened at the very first Creative Industries Clusters meeting after the funding began. And there were like 4 slides on measuring economic impact from the AHRC talking about it, and not one mentioned social impact or cultural value whatsoever. The idea that there's a hybridity of value that is possible is erased by where I think the kind of policy is moving from and to. You know, there just isn't an imaginary in there that has a holistic view of what creativity could be. And so to start wrapping up now, the paper itself from what, 5 years ago, talks a little bit about how in running a program like React, we were both complicit in the reconstitution of some of these problematic discourses and practices and playing into the hands of this process. You know, I mentioned imagining creatives as fast and agile and academics as slow lumbering beasts, and that kind of stuff. And unconsciously and maybe even consciously, we were reproducing some of those things and playing that role. But we also kind of resisted it in other ways. We tried to create space for work that mattered to the people that was doing it to happen. We tried to make space for projects that could have an economic output that you can measure, but that wasn't necessarily their primary driver. And we put that stuff into more practice in Bristol+Bath Creative R+D where possible, as well, where we also really concentrated on questions of equality and diversity and accessibility in the creative sector as well, which is something we didn't really engage with properly in the creative in React at that point in time. So there are these moments where there are counterflows, and that pushes back against the assemblage, and it kind of changes things. And if you can, you know, there's a really interesting thing happening in Bristol at the moment, which is we got one of the one of the 25, well, WECA, the West of England Combined Authority, got 25 million quid to deliver its creative local growth plan thing, which is basically 25 million quid to give to the creative sector in order to basically grow it, boost it, all that kind of stuff. And when you talk to the people in charge of WECA in charge of delivering it, they talk about, in the same way that we do, about creative ecosystems and the link between creative, like artists and cultural sector and micro businesses, all the way through how they feed into other more established sectors to make money, how the whole ecosystem needs supporting and looking after. You know, and the analogy I always use is like, there's your mushroom, but underneath you put this mycelium that produces it. And if you only count the mushroom, then you just kill off everything underneath it. Probably not strictly true, horticulturally speaking, but that's the kind of the metaphor. But then the practice, the expression of the creative local growth fund at the moment is still very much business as usual for very specific kinds of business, for very specific scales of work and all that kind of stuff. And so you can see the kind of like attempts to change not necessarily materializing there. And you can see really in that, in the same way as lots of these programs do, the kinds of creatives and cultural workers that get left behind because they don't fit into the model and the imagination of that original policy transfer kind of idea. So, yeah, I mean, just to conclude, you know, that kind of idea that we are both complicit in and trying to resist and rework, and that's what assemblage kind of allows you. You bring together this temporary assemblage of people, resources, funding, ideas, and when you're doing that, you attempt to do it in a way that leaves something slightly different behind, but it does mean that you sometimes reproduce what you're trying to avoid, because you're still having, you know, we may have done something great on the ground in Bristol, but I'm still feeding numbers essentially to the Treasury, which they then use to beat us down again. So how does that kind of really work? So I think there are opportunities and there are challenges in these things. I think I've become less hopeful. It might just be the number of years I've been doing this, but I've become less hopeful around the kind of holistic social and cultural change we need and where creativity plays a role in that, in order to affect like decent kind of change. Because I think, you know, we're still, as a nation, as a politics, dining out on the social mobility of the artists and the cultural workers of the 60s and 70s and even the 80s. You could live in a squat, you could be on the dole, you could work between the gaps. There were spaces that produced the things who we are now holding up as emblematic of particular kinds of creativity in the country, you know, particular design studios, particular legacies of ways of doing things. But there is none of that for so many people, not just in the arts and culture sector anywhere, but like, you know, so like housing, transport, all these kinds of things, wage stagnation for everybody, all this kind of stuff. So it's how does that all kind of flow into this particular sector as well? So because all I'm seeing is more money for shiny white guys to put on VR headsets, and that is really the kind of, you know, the vision that I see, and I am very uncomfortable with as well. So just to finish, a quote from Wally Mould. You know, capitalism's greatest lie is getting us to believe that the ground that it seeks to stabilise and profit from is barren and devoid of life. In work, people, politics, technology, and the city, creativity is trumpeted as the force that will change the world for the better. But don't believe this lie. Believe that creativity is about searching for, giving space to, and trying to realise the impossible. And I like that idea that actually we can think of a world where like imagination of this kind, supported properly from education everywhere else, can still feed into an economic engine, can still feed into personal well-being and growth and all those kinds of things in different ways. But there are ways that need to be human-centered to do it, because at the moment they are extractive and colonialist and challenging. There's a few references just from the talk itself, but obviously the paper has loads more. And I think that's me. There we go. I'll stop sharing. 32 minutes. I was aiming for 25, so hopefully that's not too much of a ramble for everyone.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was so interesting and so wide-ranging.
Anyway, better disappear. But thank you so much again. It was really nice to meet you both, and see you again, Dan. And yeah, I'll catch up soon, hopefully.
Yes, cheers. Thank you very much, Simon.
It's been lovely having you, Simon. Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks. Stay in touch. See you soon. Bye.